The night air was alive, with the soft glow of camera flashes and the gentle hum of conversation as Seoul's elite gathered at the luxurious grand ballroom for the annual charity gala. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing light across marble floors, and the scent of expensive perfume mingled with the aroma of champagne. Ji-Hyun, resplendent in a stunning red gown, her raven hair styled to perfection, stood poised beside her husband, Min-Soo, the notorious Korean Mafia boss. Their presence was a testament to their influence and power, and the crowd couldn't help but be drawn to them. However, beneath the facade of elegance and refinement, a sense of unease settled in the pit of Ji-Hyun's stomach. She had always been aware of the whispers, the sideways glances, and the polite smiles that hid secrets and lies. As they mingled with the guests, Ji-Hyun's closest friends, women she had trusted with her deepest secrets, began to distance themselves from her. Soo-jin, who had been her confidant for years, avoided eye contact and excused herself to the restroom. Hae-jin, another trusted ally, pretended not to hear when Ji-Hyun called her name. Their eyes, once warm and friendly, now seemed cold and calculating. The realization dawned on her that something was amiss, and her instincts screamed at her to be cautious. But it was too late. The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the crowd as a video began to play on the massive screen behind the stage. The footage showed Ji-Hyun in a compromising position with a man who was not her husband. The gasps and shocked murmurs that erupted from the audience were like a slap in the face, leaving Ji-Hyun stunned and humiliated. Her hands trembled, and she felt the heat of shame rising to her cheeks. Min-Soo's face darkened, his eyes narrowing into slits as he scanned the room, his gaze lingering on each of their so-called friends. His jaw clenched, and his fists tightened, betraying the fury that simmered beneath his composed exterior. He knew that this was no ordinary betrayal. It was a carefully orchestrated attack on his family's reputation and power. As the video ended, and the lights came back up, Ji-Hyun's friends were nowhere to be found, having disappeared into the crowd, leaving her to face the shame and embarrassment alone. Min-Soo's arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her close as he whispered words of reassurance in her ear. But Ji-Hyun's mind was reeling, her thoughts consumed by the question of who could have done this to her, and why. The rest of the evening was a blur as Min-Soo and Ji-Hyun made their way through the crowd, their smiles and laughter a mask for the turmoil that brewed inside. But as soon as they were alone in their car, the leather interior swallowing the city noise, Min-Soo's demeanor changed. His eyes burned with an inner fire, and his voice was low and menacing as he vowed to uncover the truth behind the betrayal. Ji-Hyun, still reeling from the shock, could only watch as her husband's face transformed into a mask of determination and anger. She knew that Min-Soo would stop at nothing to protect her, to avenge her honor, and that the consequences for those who had betrayed her would be severe. As they drove through the deserted streets of Seoul, the city lights blurring together like a kaleidoscope of colors, Ji-Hyun couldn't shake off the feeling of unease that had settled in her stomach. She knew that her life would never be the same, that the events of this night would set off a chain reaction of consequences that would change the course of their lives forever. And as she glanced at Min-Soo, his profile set in a determined jaw, she realized that she was not alone in this fight. Together, they would uncover the truth, and they would make those who had betrayed her pay for their treachery. The night had just begun, and the stakes were higher than ever before. The red dress she wore felt like a target now, and the weight of the betrayal pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Min-Soo sat in the back of his black sedan, the city lights of Seoul streaking past the tinted windows like blurred ghosts. His phone buzzed with updates from his men, each message adding another piece to a puzzle he was only beginning to understand. The betrayal of his wife, Ji-Hyun, had been public, humiliating, and calculated. But as the reports came in, Min-Soo realized something that made his jaw tighten. This was not the work of one enemy. It was a network. The driver took a sharp turn into the Gangnam district, where the neon signs reflected off wet pavement. Min-Soo's mind replayed the scene from the restaurant. Ji-Hyun, standing alone, surrounded by people who had smiled at her for years, The way they had turned their backs, the whispers that spread like fire. He had seen her face, the confusion and the hurt, and it had lit a fire in him that would not be extinguished. His lead investigator, a man named Park, called with a new development. One of the traitors had been identified. A woman named Soo-Jin, who had been Ji-Hyun's closest friend since college. Min-Soo felt a cold wave of fury wash over him. Soo-Jin had been at their home, had laughed with them, had held Ji-Hyun's hand during difficult times, and now she was part of this. The car stopped in front of a high-rise apartment building. Min-Soo stepped out, his tailored coat catching the wind. He did not knock on the door. His men had already opened it. Inside, the apartment was clean, modern, and empty of personal touches. Soo-Jin sat on a white sofa, her hands folded in her lap, her face pale. She did not look surprised to see him. Min-Soo did not raise his voice. He sat across from her, his eyes steady. He asked her one question. Why? Soo-Jin's voice was shaky but deliberate. She spoke of debts, of threats made against her family, of people who had promised to destroy everything she loved if she did not cooperate. She had not wanted to hurt Ji-Hyun. She had been forced. Min-Soo listened, his expression unreadable. He knew this was only the beginning. Soo-Jin gave him names, dates, locations. Each piece of information pulled back another layer of the conspiracy. The betrayal was not personal, not entirely. It was business. Someone wanted to destabilize Min-Soo's organization, and attacking his wife was the most effective way to wound him. The plan had been orchestrated by a rival faction, one that had been quietly building power for months. They had used Ji-Hyun's trust, her kindness, as a weapon. Min-Soo left Soo-Jin with a simple instruction. She would stay in the apartment, under guard, until everything was resolved. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. He did not feel pity. He felt a cold, determined fury that sharpened his focus. Back in the car, he received another call. This one was from a man named Kim, a low-level associate who had been present at the restaurant. Kim had seen something. A woman in a blue dress had been watching Ji-Hyun from across the room, her phone in hand, recording the entire scene. The woman had left before the chaos started. Min-Soo ordered his men to find her. The hunt was expanding. He now had a face, a description, and a growing list of names. The network was revealing itself, one thread at a time. He would pull every thread until the entire fabric unraveled. The car moved through the city, past the bright lights of Myeongdong, past the quiet alleys of Jongno. Min-Soo's phone glowed with a new message. A photograph. The woman in the blue dress, captured by a street camera. Her face was clear, her expression cold. He did not recognize her, but he would learn her name. He looked out the window, his reflection staring back at him. The people who had betrayed Ji-Hyun thought they were safe. They thought they had covered their tracks, but they had made one mistake. They had hurt the one person he would never stop protecting. And now, he would make them understand the weight of that mistake. He would make them beg. Min-Soo moved without warning, his fist connecting with Sung-Ho's jaw in a sharp crack. Sung-Ho's head snapped back, the smug smile replaced by shock and pain. He stumbled, caught by two of Min-Soo's men who held him upright. "You talk about the future," Min-Soo said, his voice low and controlled. "But your future is a small, dark room. You will sit in it and think about why you are there." Sung-Ho tried to spit blood, his eyes wild. "You think you have won?" This was just the first move. Min-Soo ignored him, turning to the other men who had stood with Sung-Ho. Their earlier bravado was gone, replaced by fear and uncertainty. The driver with the scar was trembling visibly, his hands still raised in surrender. "You," Min-Soo said, pointing at the driver. "You drove my wife. You knew where she would be." The man flinched. "He said it was just to talk, to make a point." "He used you," Min-Soo stated, his voice firm but calm. "And you let him. You will answer for that." He did not raise his voice, but the quiet certainty in his words filled the room more completely than any shout. He looked at each man in turn, holding their gaze for a second. Some looked away immediately, while one tried to hold his stare but failed, his eyes dropping to the polished floor. Ji-Hyun watched from a few steps away, her initial shock settling into a cold clarity. She saw not just the betrayal, but the fear it was built upon. These were not brave men making a stand. They were frightened ones, grabbing for power they thought was slipping. She stepped forward, her shoes clicking softly on the marble. "My husband offered you respect," she said, her voice clear in the tense quiet. "He offered you a place, and you traded it for this?" She gestured to Sung-ho, still held between the two men, his lips swollen and bleeding. Her words seemed to shame them more than Min-Soo's threats. One of the younger men, a kid barely out of his 20s, wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand. The air was thick with the weight of their actions, and the realization that they had made a grave mistake. Min-Soo returned his attention to Sung-ho. "Who are the others? Name them." Sung-ho laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "Go to hell." Min-Soo considered him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slightly to the man holding Sung-ho's left arm. The man applied pressure in a specific way, and Sung-ho gasped, his knees buckling. "I do not have time for games," Min-Soo said, his voice firm. "You will tell me everything, now or later, in that dark room. The choice is only about how much pain you feel before you speak." The defiance in Sung-ho's eyes wavered, replaced by a dawning understanding of his new reality. He was not a player anymore. He was a prisoner. His shoulders slumped, and he spoke in a barely audible whisper. "Choi, from the shipping division, and Lee, the accountant." Min-Soo listened, his face impassive. He already knew, and the confirmation was just a formality. When Sung-ho finished, Min-Soo turned away from him as if he had ceased to exist. "Take them all," Min-Soo said to his head of security, who had appeared silently at his elbow. "Separate rooms. I want full statements by morning." As his men began to move the subdued group out, Min-Soo walked back to Ji-Hyun. The confrontation was over, but the air still thrummed with its aftermath. He reached for her hand, and his fingers were warm and steady around hers. "It is done here," he said, his voice low and reassuring. She nodded, squeezing his hand. For now, he led her toward the exit, the soft glow of the city lights outside a stark contrast to the darkness they had just faced. They did not look back at the room where loyalty had been broken. They stepped out into the cool night air of Seoul, the city lights glittering like a field of fallen stars. The door closed behind them, sealing the silence inside. The sound of the city, a gentle hum of traffic and distant music, enveloped them, a reminder that life went on, even in the face of betrayal. The days that followed were a blur of activity. Min-Soo worked from early morning until late at night, phone pressed to his ear, meeting after meeting in the back rooms of restaurants and the private lounges of hotels. Ji-Hyun watched him from the doorway of their apartment, the city lights of Seoul flickering behind her. She had not slept well since the confrontation. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of those who had laughed at her, who had whispered behind her back. She heard the silence that had fallen when Min-Soo stepped forward. One evening, he came home with a small box. He placed it on the table between them without a word. Ji-Hyun opened it slowly. Inside was a pendant, simple and elegant, with a single jade stone at its center. She looked up at him, questions in her eyes. "It belonged to my mother," Min-Soo said. His voice was rough, tired. She wore it every day. She said it reminded her that she was not alone. Ji-Hyun touched the stone with her fingertips. It was cool and smooth. She did not know what to say, so she simply nodded. He sat down across from her, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside, a car honked twice, then fell silent. "We are meeting the Song family tomorrow," Min-Soo said. "They want to see you." Ji-Hyun felt her stomach tighten. The Song family was one of the oldest in the organization. They had stayed neutral during the betrayal, watching from the sidelines. Now they wanted to see where her loyalty stood. "I will be there," she said. Min-Soo reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was warm, calloused. "You do not have to prove anything to them," he said. "You have already proven everything to me." The next morning, they drove to a private hanok north of the city. The building was old, with curved roofs and wooden beams that smelled of pine and incense. Ji-Hyun wore a simple black dress, the jade pendant resting against her chest. Min-Soo walked beside her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. Inside, the Song patriarch sat on a cushion, a cup of tea cooling in front of him. He was an old man with gray hair and sharp eyes. He looked at Ji-Hyun for a long time before speaking. "You stood your ground," he said. "Not many would have." Ji-Hyun met his gaze. "I stood because I had no other choice." The old man nodded slowly. He picked up his tea and took a sip. "Loyalty is not given," he said. "It is earned. You have earned mine." After the meeting, Min-Soo and Ji-Hyun walked through the garden behind the hanok. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wet earth and blooming jasmine. Ji-Hyun stopped beside a small pond, watching the koi fish glide beneath the surface. "He was testing me," she said. "Yes," Min-Soo said. "And you passed." She turned to face him. "What happens now?" "What?" He stepped closer, his hand brushing against hers. "Now we rebuild, together." Over the following weeks, Ji-Hyun began attending meetings on her own. She learned the names of the players, the alliances, the debts owed, and the favors promised. She sat in rooms filled with smoke and tension, and she spoke when she had something to say. The other men learned to listen. One night, after a long dinner with a rival faction, Min-Soo found her in the kitchen of their apartment, staring out the window. He poured 2 glasses of water and handed one to her. "You are doing well," he said. Ji-Hyun took the glass but did not drink. "I am learning to survive. That is not the same as living," he said. She looked at him then, really looked. The lines around his eyes had deepened. His shoulders, once so broad, seemed to carry a weight she had not noticed before. "I am learning to live too," she said. "It just takes time." He nodded. They stood together in the quiet kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Ji-Hyun felt the pendant against her chest, warm from her skin. She thought about his mother, about the woman who had worn it before her. She thought about the road ahead, uncertain and long, but she was not walking it alone. And that, she realized, was enough.